Tonight's story begins in Northern California during the late 1960s. A period of social change, expanding suburbs, and growing communities connected by highways and open landscapes. It was a time when many people experienced a sense of freedom and movement, traveling between cities, parks, and rural areas with relative ease. Within this setting, a series of crimes began to occur that would later become associated with a single unidentified individual known only by a chosen name. What made these events particularly unusual was not only the violence itself, but the way the offender communicated. Letters were sent to newspapers, messages were written in coded form, and public attention grew as authorities attempted to verify whether the communications were genuine. Investigators faced the challenge of pursuing an unknown suspect across multiple jurisdictions while also responding to intense media interest and community concern. Over time, the case expanded beyond individual incidents. It became a complex investigation involving local police departments, forensic analysis, witness accounts, and public appeals for information. Despite substantial effort, the identity of the offender was never conclusively established. Decades later, the case continues to be examined through both historical records and modern forensic techniques, reflecting the enduring uncertainty that surrounds it. As you settle in, allow the story to unfold slowly and calmly. There is no need to focus on outcomes or conclusions. Instead, we will follow the documented events, the investigative process, and the environment in which authorities worked, exploring how a series of crimes came to occupy a lasting place in criminal history while remaining unresolved. During the late 1960s, Northern California was a region shaped by both rapid growth and cultural change. Cities such as San Francisco, Vallejo, and Napa were connected by expanding road networks that allowed people to travel easily between urban centers and quieter suburban or rural areas. Communities were developing outward, with residential neighborhoods appearing alongside farmland, open hills, and coastal landscapes. This mixture of populated and isolated environments created spaces where individuals could move between busy areas and secluded locations within relatively short distances. The social atmosphere of the period was also evolving. The decade was marked by shifting cultural attitudes, political activism, and new forms of expression, particularly in cities like San Francisco. At the same time, many suburban communities maintained routines that felt stable and predictable. Families gathered in parks, couples drove to scenic viewpoints, and young people spent evenings socializing in areas that offered privacy away from crowded neighborhoods. These everyday patterns of behavior would later become relevant to investigators examining where incidents occurred. Geographically, Northern California presented a wide variety of terrain. Valleys, wooded areas, and waterfront locations existed alongside residential streets and commercial districts. Some of the sites connected to the case were located near recreational areas, places that were accessible by car but not constantly occupied. Such environments offered both convenience and seclusion, conditions that could complicate investigations by limiting the number of witnesses present at critical moments. Transportation habits also played a role in shaping the investigative landscape. Private vehicle ownership was common, and road travel allowed individuals to cross jurisdictional boundaries without difficulty. Police departments operated within defined city or county limits, meaning that coordination between agencies was sometimes required when incidents appeared related across different locations. Investigators had to consider whether crimes occurring miles apart might still involve the same individual, even when administrative boundaries separated them. Communication technology of the era reflected the period as well. Law enforcement agencies relied on radio systems and telephone communication, but information sharing between departments could still take time, especially when multiple jurisdictions were involved. Record keeping was largely paper-based, requiring manual comparison of reports and evidence. These factors influenced how quickly patterns could be identified and how efficiently investigators could coordinate responses. Media presence was another important aspect of the regional environment. Newspapers played a central role in disseminating information, and television news was becoming increasingly influential. When incidents occurred that attracted public attention, journalists reported details that reached wide audiences. This relationship between law enforcement and media would later become significant as communications from the offender were received and evaluated. From a community perspective, many residents viewed their surroundings as relatively safe. Suburban expansion often carried an expectation of stability and security compared with dense urban centers. Recreational areas were commonly used without significant concern for personal risk. This sense of normalcy shaped how early incidents were perceived, as authorities and the public initially treated them as isolated events rather than parts of a connected pattern. Investigators working within this environment faced the challenge of interpreting events across varied settings. Locations differed in terrain, lighting conditions, and accessibility, requiring careful examination of each scene while also considering potential links between them. The geographic diversity of Northern California, therefore, became an important factor in both the unfolding events and the investigative response that followed. Understanding the regional context helps explain how incidents could occur without immediate connection being recognized. Movement between locations was relatively easy. Environments ranged from busy to secluded, and administrative boundaries separated investigative authority. These conditions formed the backdrop against which the case would develop, influencing both the actions of the offender and the efforts of law enforcement attempting to identify and stop them. The earliest confirmed incidents connected to the case occurred in the city of Vallejo, California, during the final weeks of 1968. On the night of December 20th, 2 young people were parked in a secluded area on the outskirts of the city, a location commonly used by couples seeking privacy. At some point during the late evening hours, an unknown individual approached their vehicle and carried out an attack. Emergency responders were called, and the victims were transported for medical treatment, but both later died from their injuries. At the time, investigators treated the case as a serious but isolated incident. Officers secured the location, collected physical evidence, and began interviewing potential witnesses. Because the site was relatively remote, there were limited observations from members of the public. Detectives worked to reconstruct the timeline using available information, including reports of vehicle movement in the area and any sounds that might have been heard nearby. Despite these efforts, no immediate suspect was identified. Several months later, on July 4, 1969, a second incident occurred in another secluded area near Vallejo, again involving 2 individuals parked in a vehicle. The circumstances shared similarities with the earlier case, including location type and time of day. Emergency services responded quickly after one of the victims managed to seek assistance, and both individuals were transported for medical care. One survived and later provided investigators with an account of what had happened, offering important descriptive information about the suspect and events leading up to the attack. Following this second incident, police began to consider whether the 2 cases might be connected. Detectives compared physical evidence, examined ballistic findings, and reviewed witness statements from both scenes. Similarities in method and environment raised the possibility that the same offender could be responsible. This marked the beginning of a broader investigative effort that extended beyond a single event. The situation changed further when communications were received by local newspapers and police departments. Letters claimed responsibility for both incidents and included details that had not been publicly released, allowing investigators to confirm that the writer possessed knowledge connected to the crimes. These communications introduced a new dimension to the case, transforming it from a local investigation into a matter of regional concern. From an investigative standpoint, the first confirmed attacks established several important factors. They indicated that the offender targeted individuals in relatively secluded environments, approached vehicles directly, and acted within limited time windows. The incidents also demonstrated the offender's willingness to communicate with authorities and the media, suggesting a desire for recognition or control over public perception. Law enforcement agencies responded by increasing patrol presence in similar recreational areas and advising the public to remain cautious when visiting isolated locations. Detectives continued to gather information, including vehicle descriptions, suspect characteristics, and ballistic comparisons between incidents. Cooperation between departments began to expand as the possibility of a serial offender became more likely. The first confirmed attacks, therefore, represented the transition from isolated incidents to a developing pattern. Investigators were still working with limited information, but the similarities between cases and the emergence of communications claiming responsibility created urgency. Authorities recognized that identifying the offender would require coordination, persistence, and careful analysis of both physical evidence and behavioral clues. These early events set the foundation for the investigation that would follow, shaping police strategy and public awareness as the case continued to evolve in the months ahead. Following the incidents in Vallejo during 1968 and mid-1969, investigators began to recognize that the situation might be evolving. The communications received after the second attack had already suggested a deliberate effort by the offender to draw attention, and law enforcement agencies were becoming increasingly aware that they might be dealing with an individual willing to continue. This awareness changed the way authorities approached subsequent reports and public safety concerns. On September 27, 1969, another attack occurred near Lake Berryessa in Napa County. Unlike the earlier incidents involving vehicles in nighttime settings, this event took place during daylight hours in a recreational area. Two individuals had been spending time near the lake when they were approached by a man who initiated an interaction before carrying out an attack. One of the victims later survived and was able to provide investigators with a detailed description of the encounter, including clothing, behavior, and statements made by the suspect. This incident marked a shift in pattern that attracted particular attention from investigators. The change in location type, time of day, and approach suggested that the offender was adaptable rather than fixed to a single method. Detectives considered whether the same individual responsible for the earlier crimes could also be responsible here, examining both physical evidence and behavioral similarities. Communications received afterward strengthened the connection, as the writer again claimed responsibility and provided information consistent with details known to investigators. Less than a month later, on October 11, 1969, another incident occurred in San Francisco. This time, the victim was an adult male working as a taxi driver. The event took place in an urban residential area rather than a secluded recreational setting, representing another change in environment. Witnesses observed aspects of the aftermath and provided descriptions that became important to the investigation. Police response was immediate, and the case quickly attracted widespread attention due to its location within a major city. For investigators, these incidents demonstrated an escalation not only in frequency but also in complexity. The offender appeared capable of operating across multiple counties and adapting methods to different environments. This increased the difficulty of predicting future behavior and required coordination among several law enforcement agencies. Detectives examined ballistics, witness statements, and communications to determine whether all events were connected to the same individual. Public concern intensified as patterns appeared less predictable. Earlier assumptions that incidents might be limited to isolated areas were challenged by the urban setting of the San Francisco case. Communities across Northern California became more aware that the offender could operate in varied locations. Authorities responded by issuing public warnings and encouraging vigilance, though they also sought to avoid unnecessary panic. The changing pattern also influenced investigative priorities. Detectives reviewed geographical connections between incidents, considering travel routes and timing between events. They examined whether the offender might live or work within a central area that allowed movement to multiple counties. Behavioral analysis, though less formalized than modern profiling, began to play a role in thinking about possible motivations and decision-making patterns. The communications sent by the offender continued to shape the investigation during this period. Letters referenced incidents and sometimes included threats, creating additional pressure on authorities. Verifying authenticity required careful comparison with known details, and investigators worked to determine whether communications provided actionable information or primarily served to attract attention. This period of escalation transformed the case from a regional concern into one of significant public focus. Multiple jurisdictions were now involved, investigative resources were expanding, and media coverage was increasing. The offender's adaptability and willingness to communicate made the situation more complex, requiring law enforcement to respond with broader coordination and evolving strategies. The shift in patterns, therefore, marked an important stage in the case. It demonstrated that the offender's actions were not confined to a single environment, and that predicting future incidents would be challenging. Investigators faced the task of responding to a moving target across varied landscapes while attempting to interpret behavior that appeared both deliberate and unpredictable. As a series of incidents expanded across Northern California during 1968 and 1969, law enforcement agencies began shifting from isolated case responses to a more coordinated investigative approach. Initially, each event had been handled by the local department responsible for its jurisdiction. But similarities between incidents soon made it clear that cooperation would be necessary. Detectives from multiple agencies began sharing information, comparing physical evidence, and reviewing timelines to determine whether a single offender could be responsible. One of the earliest priorities was the comparison of ballistic evidence recovered from different scenes. Investigators examined shell casings and projectile characteristics to determine whether the same weapon had been used in multiple incidents. These forensic comparisons played a central role in confirming connections between cases, allowing authorities to move beyond speculation and begin treating the crimes as part of a related series. Establishing these links also justified broader coordination across departments. Communication between agencies required deliberate effort. Each police department maintained its own reporting systems, evidence storage, and investigative leadership. Detectives organized meetings, exchanged written reports, and conducted joint discussions to ensure that relevant information reached all involved parties. While cooperation was generally effective, the process was slower than modern systems due to reliance on paper documentation and limited technological integration. Investigators also worked to develop a description of the suspect based on available witness accounts. Surviving victims and bystanders provided observations regarding physical appearance, clothing, and behavior. These descriptions were circulated among agencies and used to inform patrol officers and the public. However, variations between witness statements created uncertainty, and detectives remained cautious about relying too heavily on any single account. Public safety measures became another important focus. Law enforcement issued warnings encouraging caution in isolated areas and advised residents to report suspicious behavior. Patrol presence increased in locations considered vulnerable, including parks, remote roads, and nighttime gathering areas. Authorities balanced the need to inform the public with the goal of avoiding unnecessary alarm. Recognizing that fear could spread quickly through communities already affected by media coverage, the communications sent by the offender added complexity to the investigation. Letters received by newspapers and police departments contained claims of responsibility and references to incidents. Investigators examined these communications carefully, comparing details with known evidence to verify authenticity. When information matched undisclosed facts, authorities concluded that the writer likely had direct knowledge of the crimes. This confirmation influenced investigative direction and reinforced the belief that the same individual was responsible for multiple incidents. Detectives also explored potential suspects through interviews, background checks, and examination of individuals known to frequent relevant locations. Persons of interest emerged through witness reports, prior criminal records, or behavioral concerns. Investigators assessed alibis, employment patterns, and geographic connections, attempting to determine whether any individual could be linked directly to the crimes. Despite these efforts, no suspect could be confirmed through evidence available at the time. Jurisdictional complexity remained a challenge. Incidents had occurred across different counties and within both urban and rural environments. Coordinating investigative strategies required ongoing communication and agreement between agencies with independent authority. While cooperation improved over time, differences in procedures and priorities occasionally complicated efforts. Media attention influenced the investigation as well. Public interest generated a large volume of tips and reports from citizens, many of which required evaluation. Detectives reviewed each submission for credibility, prioritizing information that could be verified through independent means. Although some tips provided useful context, many did not lead to actionable evidence, adding to the workload faced by investigators. Leadership within law enforcement recognized that the case required sustained effort rather than quick resolution. Resources were allocated to continue evidence analysis, witness interviews, and insurgency coordination. Investigators understood that identifying an unknown offender operating across multiple locations would require patience and careful documentation. The early investigative phase, therefore, reflected both determination and limitation. Authorities responded with increasing organization, applied available forensic methods, and pursued leads diligently. At the same time, technological constraints and the offender's mobility created obstacles that could not easily be overcome. This balance between active effort and inherent difficulty would continue to shape the investigation as it developed further in the months ahead. One of the most unusual and defining aspects of the case was the offender's decision to communicate directly with newspapers and, indirectly, with law enforcement. Beginning in late July 1969, several letters were received by major publications in Northern California. Each letter contained claims of responsibility for earlier attacks and included details that had not yet been released publicly. Investigators compared the information carefully against known evidence and concluded that the writer possessed knowledge consistent with someone involved in the crimes. The letters were addressed to newspapers rather than police departments, suggesting that the author intended to reach a wide audience. This approach immediately changed the nature of the investigation. Law enforcement now had to consider not only physical evidence and witness testimony, but also written communications that might reveal behavioral clues or motives. Detectives examined handwriting, language patterns, and content for indications that could assist identification, though available analytical tools were limited compared with modern forensic linguistics. One communication included a coded message, divided into sections and sent to multiple newspapers. The writer claimed that the cipher contained personal information. When members of the public later solved the code, it revealed statements referring to the writer's actions and beliefs, though it did not provide a clear identity. Investigators confirmed that the message's authenticity was consistent with earlier communications, reinforcing the connection between the letters and the crimes. The name associated with the case also emerged through these communications. In one letter, the writer referred to himself using a symbol and a chosen title, which the media began repeating in coverage. This development contributed to the public identity of the offender and increased media attention significantly. Law enforcement faced the challenge of responding to communications without encouraging further interaction or granting the writer undue influence over public perception. Subsequent letters continued to arrive over the following months. Some referenced incidents that had already occurred, while others contained threats or claims about future actions. Investigators treated each communication as potential evidence, examining postmarks, paper type, and writing characteristics. Forensic analysis of handwriting and physical materials was attempted where possible, though conclusive identification was not achieved. The relationship between law enforcement and the media became more complex during this period. Newspapers played a central role in publishing communications and informing the public, but authorities had to consider how much information should be released. Public disclosure could encourage cooperation and tips from citizens, yet it might also provide the writer with the attention being sought. Police officials sometimes requested that certain details remain confidential to preserve investigative integrity. Public reaction to the letters was significant. The idea that an unidentified individual was communicating openly with authorities and media increased. Anxiety across communities. Citizens reported suspicious behavior more frequently, and tips were sent to police departments in large numbers. While some information proved useful, much of it required careful filtering to determine credibility. Investigators devoted substantial time to reviewing submissions while continuing other aspects of the inquiry. From an investigative perspective, the letters provided both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, they confirmed that the same individual was likely responsible for multiple incidents and offered behavioral insight. On the other hand, they did not provide direct evidence sufficient for identification. The communications demonstrated intent and awareness, but lacked the specificity needed to establish a suspect conclusively. Authorities also considered the possibility that some letters might be imitations rather than authentic communications from the offender. As media attention grew, individuals unconnected to the crimes could attempt to send misleading messages. Investigators therefore evaluated each letter carefully, comparing details against verified information before determining authenticity. The offender's communication strategy influenced the investigation in lasting ways. It shaped public awareness, directed media coverage, and added a psychological dimension to the case. Investigators had to balance analytical examination of the letters with practical efforts to prevent further incidents, all while managing public concern and expectations. This period illustrated how communication can become an integral part of a criminal investigation, particularly when the offender seeks recognition or influence. The letters did not solve the case, but they became central evidence, providing insight into behavior while also increasing complexity for authorities. Attempting to identify an unknown individual operating across multiple jurisdictions. As the crimes and communications became widely known across Northern California, public concern grew steadily. News reports described the incidents, the letters, and the uncertainty surrounding the offender's identity. Communities that had previously felt relatively safe began to experience unease, particularly in areas where earlier attacks had occurred. Residents became more cautious about nighttime activities, and behaviors that once seemed routine were reconsidered through the lens of safety. Media coverage played a central role in shaping this atmosphere. Newspapers published details of the crimes, alongside excerpts from letters, and television broadcasts reported developments as they emerged. The repetition of the offender's chosen name and symbol contributed to a growing public image that extended beyond the immediate locations of the incidents. While reporting aimed to inform, it also amplified fear by emphasizing the unpredictability of the situation. Public response included increased vigilance and a willingness to report suspicious activity. Police departments received large numbers of calls from citizens who believed they had observed something relevant. Many reports were well-intentioned, but difficult to verify, requiring investigators to evaluate credibility carefully. The volume of information created additional demands on law enforcement resources, even as officers continued pursuing existing leads. Community behavior changed in noticeable ways. Couples avoided secluded areas where earlier incidents had occurred, and some recreational locations experienced reduced nighttime use. Parents expressed concern about young people traveling alone, and social gatherings sometimes shifted toward more populated environments. These adjustments reflected a natural response to uncertainty rather than direct instruction from authorities, demonstrating how perception of risk can influence daily routines. Schools and local organizations also discussed safety awareness during this period. Educational institutions sometimes addressed the situation indirectly by encouraging students to remain cautious and to travel in groups when possible. Community meetings provided opportunities for residents to share concerns and ask questions about police efforts. Authorities used these interactions to reassure the public while emphasizing practical precautions. The media environment itself contributed to both information and misunderstanding. Accurate reporting helped disseminate official statements and safety guidance, but speculation occasionally appeared alongside confirmed facts. Investigators recognized that unverified claims could create confusion, leading them to clarify information whenever possible. Maintaining credibility with the public became an important part of managing the broader impact of the case. Law enforcement agencies responded by increasing visible patrol presence and providing updates when appropriate. Officers sought to demonstrate that the situation was being taken seriously while avoiding unnecessary alarm. Balancing transparency with investigative confidentiality required careful judgment, especially when new communications from the offender were received. Psychological effects extended beyond immediate communities. The idea that an unidentified individual could act unpredictably across multiple locations created a sense of vulnerability that reached neighboring regions. People who had no direct connection to the incidents still followed news coverage closely, reflecting the broader influence of media distribution. The case became a topic of conversation in households, workplaces, and public spaces throughout the region. Despite heightened concern, daily life continued. Businesses remained open, schools operated normally, and transportation systems functioned as usual. The tension existed alongside routine activities, illustrating how communities adapt to uncertainty while maintaining normal structure. Over time, this coexistence of caution and routine became part of the regional experience during the investigation. The community impact, therefore, involved more than fear alone. It included behavioral changes, increased communication with authorities, and ongoing attention to safety awareness. Media coverage amplified the situation, but it also served as a channel for information and public engagement. Law enforcement efforts were shaped by this environment, requiring officers to manage both investigative tasks and public reassurance simultaneously. This period demonstrated how criminal events can influence entire communities, not only through direct harm, but through perception and uncertainty. The response of Northern California residents reflected resilience as well as concern, showing how people adapt when confronted with events that challenge expectations of safety. As the investigation continued across multiple jurisdictions, witness accounts remained one of the most important sources of information available to law enforcement. Survivors of earlier attacks provided descriptions of the individual involved, offering details about physical appearance, clothing, and behavior. In addition, bystanders who had been near certain locations reported observations that investigators carefully documented and compared. Each statement contributed to a developing picture, though inconsistencies between accounts created challenges in forming a precise description. One particularly significant set of observations came from witnesses who reported seeing a man in the vicinity of a crime scene shortly after an incident occurred in San Francisco. These accounts included physical characteristics and general appearance, which police used to generate composite sketches intended to assist identification. The sketches were distributed to officers and released publicly, encouraging citizens to report anyone who resembled the description. While this process increased the number of tips received, it also introduced the possibility of mistaken identification, requiring investigators to evaluate reports cautiously. Detectives examined witness statements for patterns. They considered whether descriptions from different incidents could refer to the same individual or whether variations indicated separate persons. Lighting conditions, distance, and stress levels experienced by witnesses were taken into account when assessing reliability. Investigators understood that memory can be affected by environment and circumstance, and they attempted to corroborate statements with physical evidence whenever possible. Suspect development followed naturally from these observations. Individuals whose appearance or behavior aligned with witness descriptions were identified as persons of interest. Some came to attention because they lived near relevant locations, while others were reported by acquaintances who believed they might resemble composite sketches. Law enforcement interviewed many individuals, reviewed alibis, and examined background information to determine whether further inquiry was justified. In certain cases, suspects attracted attention due to possession of items that might relate to the crimes, such as weapons or materials mentioned in communications. Investigators evaluated these situations carefully, recognizing that coincidence alone could not establish guilt. Without direct evidence linking a person to the incidents, authorities could not confirm involvement. Many individuals initially considered potential suspects were eventually excluded after verification of their whereabouts or inconsistencies in claims against them. The communications sent by the offender also influenced suspect development. Letters sometimes contained statements about motives or experiences that investigators attempted to interpret. Detectives considered whether the language suggested education level, occupation, or personal background. While such analysis could guide thinking, it remained speculative without corroborating evidence. Behavioral interpretation therefore served as a supplementary tool rather than a decisive method. Law enforcement agencies maintained lists of persons of interest throughout the investigation. These lists changed over time as new information emerged or existing leads were resolved. Investigators shared relevant details across departments to ensure that individuals identified in one jurisdiction could be evaluated in connection with incidents elsewhere. Coordination was essential given the geographic spread of events. Public involvement played a role as well. Citizens frequently contacted police with names of individuals they believed might be connected. Some reports were based on resemblance to sketches, while others reflected personal suspicion or rumors. Detectives reviewed each submission for credibility, prioritizing information supported by verifiable facts. The volume of tips required substantial effort to manage, but occasionally provided useful context. Despite extensive witness interviews and suspect evaluation, no individual could be conclusively linked to the crimes through evidence available at the time. This absence of confirmation reflected both the offender's ability to avoid identification and the investigative limitations of the era. Witness accounts provided valuable direction, but could not substitute for definitive forensic proof. The process of suspect development therefore remained ongoing. Investigators continued gathering statements, revisiting earlier reports, and comparing information across cases. Each new piece of data offered the possibility of clarification, yet certainty remained elusive. The investigation moved forward through persistence and analysis, shaped by the contributions of witnesses and the careful evaluation of individuals whose circumstances warranted attention. Forensic evidence played an important role in the investigation, but the scientific tools available during the late 1960s and early 1970s imposed clear limitations. Investigators relied heavily on physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, including ballistic materials, fingerprints, clothing fibers, and other trace elements. Each piece of evidence was examined with the goal of identifying patterns that could link incidents together or connect them to a specific individual. Ballistics analysis was among the most useful forensic methods available. Firearms evidence recovered from different scenes could be compared to determine whether the same weapon had been used. Investigators examined shell casings and projectiles under magnification, looking for unique markings created by a firearm's internal components. These comparisons helped confirm connections between certain incidents, allowing authorities to treat them as part of a related series, rather than isolated events. Fingerprint evidence was also collected when possible. Investigators searched surfaces at crime scenes for impressions that might have been left by the offender. Some prints were recovered and preserved, though determining whether they belonged to the suspect or to unrelated individuals was not always straightforward. Databases for fingerprint comparison were far more limited than those used today, and identification depended on whether a suspect's prints were already on record within law enforcement systems. Handwriting examination became relevant due to the letters sent to newspapers and police departments. Specialists compared writing characteristics across communications, analyzing letter formation, spacing, and stylistic patterns. While this process could suggest whether multiple documents were written by the same individual, it could not conclusively identify the writer without a known sample for comparison. As a result, handwriting analysis contributed insight but not definitive answers. Physical trace evidence, such as fibers or materials, was examined using available laboratory techniques. Investigators attempted to determine whether items recovered from scenes might relate to clothing or objects associated with a suspect. However, the scientific ability to match trace evidence to a specific source was limited. Conclusions often relied on general similarities rather than precise identification. Another significant limitation involved the preservation of evidence over time. Outdoor scenes were subject to environmental exposure, including weather, movement of people, and natural degradation. Even when evidence was collected promptly, storage methods of the era did not always anticipate future technological advances. Materials that might later have been useful for modern analysis were sometimes unavailable or unsuitable for testing decades later. DNA analysis, which has solved many cases in more recent years, did not exist during the original investigation. Biological evidence could not be examined at the genetic level, removing a powerful tool that modern investigators rely upon. Later attempts to apply DNA testing to preserved materials faced challenges related to contamination, degradation, or uncertainty about whether samples originated from the offender. Communication between forensic laboratories and investigative teams also required time. Reports were prepared manually, and coordination across jurisdictions could delay comparisons. While scientists worked carefully within their capabilities, the overall process was slower than contemporary forensic workflows supported by digital databases and rapid analysis techniques. Despite these limitations, forensic evidence still provided valuable information. Ballistics confirmed links between incidents. Fingerprint analysis offered potential leads, and handwriting examination helped establish patterns in communications. Investigators used these tools systematically, combining scientific findings with witness testimony and investigative reasoning. The limitations were therefore not due to lack of effort or competence. They reflected the state of technology at the time. Law enforcement and forensic professionals applied the best methods available, but certain questions required tools that had not yet been developed. This gap between available evidence and available technology contributed to the uncertainty that remained. Understanding these constraints helps explain why the investigation did not reach a definitive conclusion. Evidence existed, but the ability to interpret it fully was restricted. The case demonstrates how forensic science evolves over time, and how earlier investigations sometimes reach, boundaries that later technology may or may not overcome. As the investigation expanded across Northern California, coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies became essential. The incidents had occurred in different jurisdictions, including Vallejo, Napa County, and San Francisco, each with its own police department, leadership structure, and investigative procedures. While cooperation between agencies existed, managing information across boundaries added complexity to an already challenging case. Early in the investigation, detectives recognized that sharing evidence and intelligence would be critical to understanding whether a single offender was responsible. Meetings were organized between departments, reports were exchanged, and forensic findings were compared. Ballistic analysis linking incidents played a central role in encouraging deeper collaboration, as confirmation of connections justified broader investigative coordination. Communication methods of the era required deliberate effort. Information was transmitted through written reports, telephone calls, and in-person briefings, rather than digital systems. Maintaining consistent records across agencies demanded careful documentation, and delays could occur simply due to the time required to share materials. Investigators worked to minimize these delays, but the process remained slower than modern multi-agency operations supported by integrated databases. Jurisdictional authority also influenced investigative decisions. Each department retained responsibility for incidents occurring within its geographic boundaries, meaning that investigative leadership was distributed rather than centralized. Coordination depended on cooperation rather than unified command. While officers generally worked collaboratively, differences in procedures or priorities occasionally created challenges in aligning strategies. Federal involvement added another layer to the coordination structure. Agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation provided forensic assistance and analytical support when requested. Federal resources offered specialized expertise, particularly in laboratory analysis and communication examination. However, operational control remained primarily with local jurisdictions, requiring ongoing coordination between levels of law enforcement. Managing information flow became increasingly complex as public attention grew. Tips were received by multiple departments, sometimes containing overlapping or contradictory information. Investigators needed to ensure that relevant leads were shared across agencies while avoiding duplication of effort. Systems for cross-referencing reports were developed, though they relied heavily on manual organization. The communications sent by the offender further complicated coordination. Letters were sometimes mailed to newspapers in different cities, requiring police departments to collaborate when verifying authenticity and analyzing content. Ensuring that all agencies had access to the same information was essential for maintaining consistent investigative direction. Miscommunication or delay could risk missing connections between incidents or communications. Case complexity also arose from the offender's apparent mobility. The ability to operate across multiple counties suggested access to transportation and familiarity with different areas. Investigators considered whether the suspect might live in one jurisdiction while committing crimes in another. This possibility required agencies to look beyond local boundaries when evaluating suspects and leads. Leadership within departments recognized that coordination challenges could hinder progress if not managed carefully. Liaison roles were sometimes established to facilitate communication between agencies, and investigators made efforts to maintain regular contact. Despite these measures, the absence of a centralized command structure meant that coordination relied heavily on professional relationships and mutual cooperation. The complexity of the case extended beyond geography. Evidence analysis, witness testimony, communications, and public involvement all required integration into a coherent investigative picture. Managing these elements across multiple organizations increased the difficulty of reaching definitive conclusions. Each agency contributed pieces of information, but assembling them into a complete understanding remained challenging. This multi-agency environment reflects the realities of law enforcement. When crimes cross jurisdictional boundaries, cooperation can expand resources and expertise, yet it also introduces organizational challenges that require careful management. In this case, coordination efforts were substantial, but the offender's ability to avoid identification persisted despite collaboration. The investigation, therefore, became not only a search for an unknown individual, but also an exercise in insurgency coordination under technological and organizational limitations. These factors contributed to the enduring complexity that would continue to shape the case in the years that followed. As the early 1970s approached, the frequency of confirmed incidents associated with the case began to decline. After the events of 1969, investigators continued to receive communications and occasional claims of responsibility for additional crimes, but establishing clear connections became increasingly difficult. Without consistent physical evidence linking new incidents to the earlier series, authorities had to evaluate each report cautiously, separating confirmed facts from unverified claims. Law enforcement agencies remained actively engaged during this period. Detectives continued reviewing evidence, re-examining witness statements, and pursuing leads that had not yet been resolved. Suspects identified earlier in the investigation were revisited when new information emerged, and investigators worked to determine whether any individual could be conclusively connected to the crimes. Despite these efforts, no definitive identification was achieved. Communications attributed to the offender continued sporadically. Some letters referenced earlier events or included statements suggesting ongoing activity. Investigators examined each communication for authenticity, comparing writing style, details, and physical characteristics with previously confirmed materials. In some cases, authenticity could not be established with certainty, leaving authorities uncertain about whether the offender remained active or whether others were attempting to imitate earlier communications. The apparent reduction in incidents created both relief and uncertainty within communities. Public concern gradually decreased as time passed without confirmed new crimes, yet the lack of resolution meant that questions remained. Authorities could not determine whether the offender had ceased activity voluntarily, relocated, been prevented by circumstance, or died. Without new evidence, these possibilities remained speculative. Investigative resources began to shift as immediate urgency lessened. Law enforcement agencies continued maintaining case files and reviewing information, but attention also had to be allocated to other active investigations. The case transitioned from an immediate operational priority to a longer-term inquiry, preserved within departmental records and periodically revisited when potential leads appeared. Media coverage also evolved during this period. While public attention remained, reporting became less frequent as new developments slowed. Occasional communications or claims would renew interest temporarily, but sustained coverage declined compared with the intense focus of earlier months. The case gradually moved from daily news into a category of unresolved investigations that resurfaced periodically. Detectives continued exploring possible suspects when new information surfaced. Some individuals came to attention through witness reports, personal connections, or tips from the public. Investigators examined these leads carefully, reviewing alibis, backgrounds, and any available evidence. Many suspects were eventually excluded due to lack of corroboration or conflicting information. The absence of conclusive evidence remained the central obstacle. The ongoing inquiry also involved maintaining communication between agencies that had participated in the earlier investigation. Records were preserved, and information sharing continued when relevant developments occurred. Coordination remained important because any new evidence could potentially relate to incidents across multiple jurisdictions. From an investigative perspective, the decline in confirmed activity did not mean the case was closed. Instead, it entered a phase characterized by persistence rather than urgency. Authorities remained open to new information while acknowledging that the likelihood of immediate resolution had decreased. This transition is common in complex cases where evidence is limited and suspects remain unidentified. The uncertainty surrounding the offender's status contributed to the enduring nature of the case. Without confirmation that activity had ended permanently, investigators had to consider the possibility that the individual might still exist or that related information could emerge in the future. Maintaining records and preserving evidence therefore remained essential. This period illustrates how investigations can evolve over time, shifting from active pursuit to long-term inquiry while remaining unresolved. The absence of new incidents provided some reassurance to the public, yet the unanswered questions continued to occupy both investigators and communities. The case moved forward into history, carrying uncertainty alongside the documented facts that had already been established. In the decades following the original investigation, interest in the case continued among law enforcement, researchers, and the public. Advances in forensic science created the possibility that evidence collected years earlier might yield new information. Investigators periodically revisited preserved materials, examining whether modern techniques could clarify questions that had remained unresolved since the late 1960s and early 1970s. One area of focus involved biological evidence potentially associated with letters and physical items connected to the case. With the development of DNA analysis in the late 20th century, forensic laboratories gained the ability to examine genetic material at a level that had not previously been possible. Authorities explored whether any preserved samples might contain usable DNA that could be compared against known individuals or databases. However, challenges quickly became apparent. Evidence from earlier decades may have been contaminated, degraded, or handled in ways that made reliable analysis difficult. Determining whether any biological material originated from the offender rather than another source also presented uncertainty. Despite these limitations, forensic testing efforts continued at various points. Investigators remained cautious about drawing conclusions without clear scientific validation. In some instances, partial findings were reported publicly, but confirmation sufficient for definitive identification was not achieved. The gap between technological capability and available evidence remained a central obstacle. Later investigative reviews also re-examined suspect information developed during the original inquiry. Individuals who had previously attracted attention were reassessed in light of new knowledge, and background information was compared against evolving forensic standards. While some suspects appeared plausible based on circumstantial factors, none could be conclusively linked to the crimes through verifiable evidence. Professional investigators generally maintained that without confirmation supported by reliable data, no individual could be declared responsible. Public interest remained strong over the years, leading to books, documentaries, and independent research efforts. Some analyses proposed specific suspects or interpretations of events, often drawing on historical records and witness accounts. While such work contributed to discussion, it also introduced speculation that required careful separation from confirmed facts. Authorities consistently emphasized that official conclusions must rely on verifiable evidence rather than interpretation alone. The case also influenced forensic and investigative practice more broadly. It demonstrated the importance of evidence preservation and documentation, particularly in cases that might remain unresolved for extended periods. Lessons drawn from earlier investigations contributed to improvements in how materials are collected, stored, and analyzed in modern law enforcement. Continuing questions persist largely because the available evidence does not allow certainty. Witness descriptions varied, communications provided limited identifying information, and physical evidence could not establish a definitive suspect. These factors leave room for multiple interpretations, but none have achieved confirmation. The case therefore remains officially unresolved, despite decades of attention. For investigators, unresolved cases represent both challenge and responsibility. Records are maintained, evidence is preserved where possible, and new leads are evaluated when they emerge. Even after many years, the possibility exists that new information could provide clarity. Advances in technology, changes in databases, or previously unknown witnesses could potentially contribute to understanding. From a historical perspective, the enduring uncertainty reflects the complexity of the investigation rather than a lack of effort. Law enforcement agencies applied available methods diligently during the original inquiry and continued revisiting the case as technology evolved. The absence of resolution highlights how some investigations reach boundaries that cannot easily be crossed. Even with modern tools, the continuing questions surrounding the case, therefore, remain part of its legacy. They represent the intersection of human behavior, investigative effort, and technological limitation across time. While answers have not been confirmed, the investigation continues to exist within institutional memory, open to the possibility that clarity may still emerge in the future. As this story settles into the quiet of the night, what remains most noticeable is the passage of time and the way certain events continue to exist within memory long after they occurred. The landscapes of Northern California have changed over the decades. Communities have grown and generations have lived their lives in places connected to the investigation. Yet the uncertainty surrounding the case has remained, carried forward through records, discussions, and quiet reflection. Investigations like this remind us that certainty is not always possible, even when significant effort is applied. Law enforcement agencies worked within the tools available to them, and later generations continued examining the evidence with newer technologies. The absence of definitive answers does not erase that work. Instead, it highlights the complexity of human behavior and the limitations that sometimes exist in reconstructing events. There is also a calm understanding that unresolved cases become part of history rather than ongoing tension. Questions remain, but they no longer carry the urgency they once did. Time softens the edges of events, allowing them to rest within the key memory rather than dominate attention. The individuals involved lived real lives within specific moments, and those moments now belong to the past. Tonight, there is no need to search for conclusions or certainty. The story can simply exist as it is, shaped by facts, uncertainty, and the passage of years. Some investigations reach clear outcomes, while others remain open within the historical record. Both forms are part of how societies remember and learn. As you rest, you can allow the details to fade gently, leaving only the quiet awareness that the world continues forward. Communities rebuild, routines return, and time creates distance from events that once felt immediate. The unknown does not disturb the calm. It simply becomes part of the larger landscape of memory. The night deepens, the surroundings grow still, and the story settles into silence, where reflection replaces urgency and where unanswered questions remain peacefully within the past.